What's up, everyone, and welcome to the Long Game Podcast hosted by Thomas Kopelman and Jacob Turner. In each episode, you'll hear us break down financial topics that are relevant to you and your situation. Our goal is to help bring credible financial information to you in short, bite-sized episodes.
All opinions expressed on this show are for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on the Long Game Podcast should be considered advice. Always consult with your team of professionals before making any decisions regarding your finances.
All right, hello, and welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Long Game Podcast. I'm your co-host, Thomas Kopelman, here with me, Jacob Turner, and today we have a very special repeat guest. So we have Daniel Crosby on, which, if you don't know him, I don't know what you're really doing. He's one of the best authors in the personal finance space. We had him on last time to talk about his last book, and this time we're having him talk about his new book, The Soul of Wealth. So I'm going to show everybody because the cover is awesome. It's a really incredible book. And today we're actually going to go through every chapter that I think is relevant to you. So this is going to be a way longer episode than normal. I know we've been cutting it down to 20 or 30 minutes, but when you get somebody like Daniel on, you don't cut them short. I think there's so many good things to talk about in this book. So Daniel, thank you for coming on and just kind of giving the time to everybody here.
Guys, great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're really excited. So, we're just going to kind of dive through different topics. And what I love about, the way that you write your books, especially this book, is like you have this great topic, you have a great story that isn't related to finance at all, and then you wrap it in. It's, kind of almost in the way of like, I think that's kind of how Morgan Housel does it too. He just takes these really great stories and is like, here's why this is applicable and here's how we apply it to finance, which I love. So I know you're going to tell a lot of stories today. And just for time's sake, I just want to jump right into it. And, one thing that I loved is that you started the book with wealth just being that wealth is not just a number. Talk to us a little bit about that. What does that really mean?
Yeah, so the story I used to illustrate that was the story of Alexander the Great. And so by sort of traditional, by traditional yardsticks of success, power, respect, money, Alexander was one of the best to ever do it. He started waging war when he was 20 years old. He didn't lose a battle for well over a decade straight of continuous warfare. He was the second richest person to ever live. Only Genghis Khan was wealthier. He's, 10 times wealthier than the richest person living today by even the most conservative estimate. But then his life was absolutely undone by something so human, which is at the siege of Tyre, at the Battle of Tyre, he lost his best friend. One of his generals named Hephaestion died at the siege of Tyre. And Alexander was completely undone by this. He started drinking, he started being reckless, he started making poor decisions, and it eventually killed him. And it's fascinating to see the parallels in our own lives, right? Like when I talk about setting New Year's resolutions, and financial resolutions are usually number one, health, weight loss and health resolutions are usually number two. And then you look at how people evaluate their lives when they're at the end of their lives. And I talk about some of the research done by Bronnie Ware into the top 5 regrets of the dying. And when we're at the end of our lives, right? So when we're going through our lives, it's work, 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 money, money, money. And then when we get to the end of our lives and we see what matters with complete clarity, Bronnie Ware talks about work only comes up once. And it's, I wish I hadn't worked so much. And it's just pretty fascinating to see, the story of Alexander, the story of each of our lives. Money, power, respect, fame can't insulate us from some of the worst things in life. And still things like relationships are going to matter a great deal more than the money you have in your bank. And we'd be wise to listen to the voices that see that most clearly and not wait until, the sand is running out of our hourglass to start to make those changes in our own lives.
I think that's really interesting because I think with the Alexander the Great story, I think that hits home for a lot of people, right? Like you can have everything that you want in life. You can have unlimited money, but right, like you lose your spouse, like your kids don't love you anymore. Like, of course you can understand that you're not going to be happy. And I think maybe for some people that still is a little bit of a revelation, because I remember as a kid like looking up to pro athletes, right? We got Jacob right here, we got a fellow pro athlete, but I remember like hearing about people being unhappy as pro athletes, and you're kind of like, what? How? You get to play a sport for your whole life, but you can't really, as a young person, take away the fact of like, hey, there is still life outside of the job, right? You might have a cool job, but you still have a regular life like everybody else. But now the other thing I think is a little bit hard is, so now we talk about, right, you don't talk about work at the end of life. But at the same time, we do know that like having meaningful work, working hard towards something, achieving something really does play into your happiness. So I think the way that I look at that is, okay, well, if you just pursue money and that's all you have, of course, you're going to be unhappy. But do you think that people who look back on their life sometimes do say, I got really lucky. I got to work in something I love. I got to make really, really good money. And that for some people, work would really still fall up there, but it ties back to purpose and meaning.
So you make a great point, because later in that chapter, I introduce, basically the secret of life, the secret of the meaning of life. Later in that chapter, through this positive psychology research, there's basically a 5-part framework for human flourishing. And one of those 5 parts is deep work. It's deep, meaningful work. So we have this weird paradox that work is key to happiness. And yet most people get to the end of their lives and they say, well, I kind of did work wrong. So I think we're optimizing for the wrong things. I think we're optimizing for paycheck instead of optimizing for fulfillment. And I got 3 kids. I got a mortgage. Like there's practical considerations, and that is what it is. But I think once those basic needs are met, and for a lot of people, they're met, rather quickly, they're still optimizing for the wrong thing. They're not optimizing for the thing that's going to bring them fulfillment, or the thing that's going to help them, quote unquote, skip to work, like Warren Buffett says that he does. They're optimizing for that incremental $1,000 or $5,000, even if it comes with more travel and longer hours and a longer commute. And that is not the thing that makes us happy.
So you can go, Jacob.
What's really interesting? Thomas, you were talking about pro athletes, and Daniel, to your point, I think two concepts that come up in pro sports around money that are really interesting tie-ins to what you talked about there was, I think a lot of people get to the end of their life, okay, whether it's, 60, 70, 80 years old, and they're able to really look back and reflect and understand that, hey, maybe the value of this work I put in to buy the next car, or the next house, or the next vacation, like wasn't worth it for me. And what's a really unique takeaway that I've experienced, and I think I'm seeing more and more with some of the athletes we work with, is like they get the benefit of hopefully experiencing that like in a 10-year time period. Because like if they came into the money at 18 to 21, hopefully by the time they're 30, they've really kind of gone through the whole gamut. They've like bought the car, they bought the house, they did all the cool things. They're like, I still feel the same. And then I think secondarily to that point is, Thomas, you talked about like pro athletes being unhappy. Like some of the most unfulfilled people that I've talked to are retired athletes that have all the money in the world. They have sit on the couch money. And they're like, well, why am I so like unfulfilled? And I think, Daniel, it's to your point of like, if they don't have something that is purposeful in their life that they're working towards, then like they're extremely unfulfilled. And it resonates a lot with me when you say that, because, these are people that have, they might have 20, 30, $40 million in the bank where they could spend it on anything. And they're sitting there on the couch thinking like how unfulfilled they are.
So Jacob, your point is fantastic. And maybe this is a good time to break out that 5-part model, because it's called the PERMA model. The P in PERMA is for positive experiences. This is like fun and leisure. The retired professional athlete with $30 million in the bank can have effectively unlimited fun and leisure, right? You can have a second home, you can drive a fancy car, you can do what you want, right? So they are sort of maxed out on that. And when we, from the outside looking in, evaluate what we think other people's happiness should look like, we absolutely over-index on the P, the positive experiences, the fun and the leisure. The E in PERMA is for engagement. That's that deep work. This retired athlete was at the absolute top of the mountain with deep work, right? training, prepping, ascending through the farm leagues, and then getting to the pros and getting to the show. And now that's all gone, right? The deep work, if they don't find something like Jacob, right, to replace that, there's a void there. The R is for relationships. Work is really good at building relationships around people. M is meaning, working for something bigger than you. That could be God, spirituality, teamwork, philanthropy. Family, whatever that is. But again, in the case of the professional athlete, that would be, it wouldn't necessarily be gone, but it would certainly be dramatically changed. And then the A is for advancement. If you get, again, we got Jacob here, you're using advancement. For a lot of folks, there's a very clear path of advancement to a point. A ball, double A ball, triple A ball, the show, the all-star game, you're up, 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 up. Now you're retired. The average athlete's career is a couple years long. Like that, a couple in the NFL, I think it's like two or 3 years.
Yep.
And you were for your whole life, you were advancing up through the ranks of this very hierarchical system. And now you're rich and there's no more mountains to climb. There's a real need in humankind to be getting better, to be better today than we were yesterday. Professional sports provides that in a very linear way. The average large organization provides that in a very linear, hierarchical way. But for certain folks who have exited a business, folks who have sort of retired from a sporting career, that's absent. And so everyone else is looking at is that P. Meanwhile, the meaning's gone, the advancement's gone, the relationships are gone, and there's a real void. So it's understandable when you understand sort of human flourishing holistically. It's not easy. It's not hard to see why a professional athlete would have a hard time that no one understands.
Well, I think the other hard part here too is it's like those might equal 100%, but they're not all 20 for every person, right? So like you look at the average high performing person or athlete or whatever, and like the achievement working towards something and hitting those goals is probably a higher percentage than some of the other parts, right? Maybe those experiences, part of that is, what you do accomplish, but how does somebody tangibly take this away and figure out like, how do I create the meaningful life for myself?
So we've actually, my employer Orion has actually developed a tool to do this, right? Because if you think about these 5 things, they're not all equally meaningful to any given person at any given time. So what we have people do is stack order them. And I mean, you could do this with index cards, right? Yep. So take these 5 things, rank them in the order that they are important to you. And then to the right of that, write 1 to 10, how am I doing? How am I doing here? And then look for the biggest disconnect between importance and execution, right? So for me right now, father of 3 children who are still in the home, relationships are number 1, right? Like I'm trying to make memory. I got a high school kid. Like I'm trying to make memories before she's gone, and the bulk of my time with her is spent. And so that's number 1 for me. For someone in their early 20s, it could very well be work, or, for that professional athlete, it could be that engagement piece. For someone in retirement, it could be that leisure piece. So, your mileage may vary, but everyone needs these in some combination, and they tend to be the ingredients of a happy life.
Yeah.
What I think on the surface, there are things that, I think anybody listening is like, oh yeah, that makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. But how often do we actually sit down and do it? And I think, Daniel, to your point, like the index cards are great. At the firm I was at previous to Starting Moment, we used index cards like that to help people go through this process. I remember when I first went through it, I was like, oh, these seem so simple, but they were so impactful because, like, to your point, for you, Daniel, if your top priority right now is relationships and your kids, but then you wake up on Monday and you're like, okay, I just worked for 8 hours on Monday, and that was, 8 of my 12 waking hours. Like, now what else am I doing? right? And
Yeah.
I think it's being intentional about like whatever those things are in your life. And Thomas, to your point, I think you make a great point. Like they're not the same for everybody, which is what makes them hard because they're not some formula that you can just plug in and get the answer.
Yeah, there's the one more thing about this. We won't go into this whole chapter, but I have another chapter that's basically, the way you spend your time and the way you spend your money is a great BS indicator about what you really value. I think a lot of times we profess to value one thing, and then the way we spend our time and the way we spend our money, which is a better predictor, it's a more honest sort of accounting of what we really value, tells a different story. So, Jacob's example he just gave is like, yeah, I profess to value my kids, but is that where is that where my time and treasure are going? Like, maybe not. Your budget can actually be sort of this great window into your soul and tell you more about where you're lying to yourself.
Yeah, and it takes some honesty here, right? Because I think a lot of people, if you ask them like what's important to them, what's their values, what's their goals, they're going to give you the surface level correct answers, right? But I think to your point, if you actually look in their spending, you actually look in their time, is what they're doing proving that or not? And I would say for most people, it's probably not. But I think the hard part there comes into play of like, but then you mix in life. So like my most important goal might be like, I want to be a great husband. Like it could be like, I want to be a great dad, all these things. But I also did recently start a business and I do need to make money and I do have this opportunity to build this business. And it's like, so maybe it's not always perfectly going to work out in the way of like, that might be your first value, but you still have like, but I have this commitment and I have to make sure I build this and I can't let the business fail and blah, blah, blah. So it becomes hard to balance all of it and truly show and reflect that how you spend your money, how you spend your time is actually in the way that's most important.
Daniel, one question I had for you, and this is more of personal curiosity, but I think as I've worked with more people, especially young individuals, people from 18 to 30, like how they view money is so affected by how they grew up with money and what their relationship was to money growing up. I'd be curious, what was your relationship like with money growing up as a kid, and how has that either evolved, changed, stayed the same as you've gotten older?
Yeah, so it's a great observation, Jacob. So one of the things that psychology tells us is there's these two things that have sort of an outsized imprint on how we think about anything, but we'll use money as the example, and it's called primacy and recency. So we know that like early experiences are deeply formative, and then of course, recent experiences also carry sort of an outsized impact. So I grew up the son of a financial advisor, but my dad got his job the day I was born. So my dad was cutting lawns. He had dropped out of his MBA program. My mom was working at McDonald's when she was pregnant with me. And so we didn't have a lot of money. I mean, my dad was like dialing for dollars and cold calling and stuff when I was a kid. And, I've told the story about my first ever memory of money was coming home in kindergarten with a form. I grew up in Alabama, and I came home from kindergarten with this form from the school to see if I could get free lunch, like get free or reduced cost lunch at school. And my parents filled it out at the kitchen table, and they're like, "Oh, hey, we qualify for free lunch." And I was like, "Are we poor?" And I had always thought of us as, to the extent that I had thought about it, I had always thought that we were, quote unquote normal, that we were kind of middle class. And this was this sort of realization like, oh, we don't have much money. But then, as my dad's career took off, I have a brother who's 12 years younger than me. I mean, he grew up effectively with the same parents in an entirely different world. And so you see that today in the way that I think about and spend money and have planned my career, and the way that my brother thinks about and spends money and has planned his career. I just have I have a much more pronounced sense of scarcity. I am more money minded. He is much more of sort of a passion first career guy, and like the money will take care of itself. And it's a fascinating study because it's like same house, same parents, same genetics, and yet our money lives couldn't be more different because he's much younger than me. And I mean, I grew up with poor parents, and he grew up with wealthy parents, and it's fascinating to see through that primacy and recency how that impacts attitudes well into adulthood.
So it's interesting you say that. I'm curious from your perspective, do you see, you mentioned like some of your biases might be that like I might be more conservative with some of my situations than my brother might be because of how I grew up. Do you think it's important for people to not only recognize those potential blind spots or biases that they have, and should they take action on them, or do you think they should just lean into them? And the reason why I asked the question is one thing that I think I've come around to this idea that there's a million different ways for people to invest money, make money, spend money, save money. And there's not one right or wrong way to do it. And although I might be able to show you on a spreadsheet that, hey, if you took on more risk in your investment portfolio over 20 years, you could make more money, that doesn't mean it's right for everybody. So I'm curious, with all the learnings that you've had, do you think it makes more sense for somebody to lean into those biases because it will help them stick to whatever they're willing to do, or to try to challenge those biases?
That is an awesome question. So I actually wrote a chapter about this for the book, and it was the 51st chapter. I cut it, and so I actually released it as an episode of my podcast. But I'll share the learnings here on your podcast. The short answer is, if you can lean into a bias, you should. And so here's the example that I'll give. You think about what we know about human behavior. We know that humans are lazy, status quo prone, change averse, forgetful. And those tendencies lead a lot of people to not prepare for their financial lives, right? But we also know that if someone can start, if they can overcome those tendencies for literally one afternoon and like set up an account that will auto withdraw and auto escalate their savings over their lifetime, they can actually get laziness, forgetfulness, and status quo proneness to work in their favor, because the automating of that process takes all those nasty negative things about human nature, flips them on their head, and now makes them work for you. So my son does karate, and there's this idea in martial arts of a circular theory of self-defense. Like if someone attacks you, if someone throws a punch at you, rather than trying to block the brunt of that, sort of head on, you roll with that resistance, let them use that exertion against themselves, and let them kind of like wear themselves out and use that exertion against themselves. The same thing is true of human behavior, right? A lot of times when we think about our tendencies, our biases, we want to like white knuckle our way past it. We want to go, I'm just going to be so much willpower, just so much force of will that I'm not going to be like that. But if you can find a way to make that bias work for you, you absolutely should. It's much easier.
So question, going back to, before this episode, I was talking a little bit about like, I found myself naturally working with a lot of people who are very wealthy, but came from not very much wealth. And before, the years before this, when I work with people didn't really bring up their childhood very much and how money was rooted in them. But I think sometimes because they don't have so much extra, maybe they're not thinking as much about that. They're just kind of in survival stage. But now with the people I work with, I would say about 50% of them bring up their money story unprompted. Like they naturally are just like, yeah, so like, we're thinking about buying a house, but like, I just can't get myself to buy the house. Like it's, the cheapest one, we live in California, cheapest I could buy is 1.2 million. And my parents would die hearing I bought a house that was that much money. Like we grew up with no money. Like we didn't get to have the things like, not that we weren't fine, but we didn't really have any money. But they naturally go into this money story. And the thing that I found most often is that people struggle to spend because of this. They're like, let's say they make $1 million and they're going to buy a $2 million house. They can't get themselves to do it. even though their parents make 100K and bought a $500,000 house, right? Like the proportions of income being spent is vastly different, but their whole life, what was rooted in them is spend the least amount of dollars you possibly can. Don't buy anything like overly nice and save every dollar. Like how do people overcome that? And like how, I'm going to leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So if you go back to my story, I talked about feeling middle class or, feeling normal. That's what everyone feels. A fish doesn't know that it's wet. However you grew up, that's your equilibrium, right?
Yeah.
Like that's your equilibrium, that's your stasis, that's your sort of happy place. And so I think the first thing we have to help folks understand is that you exist along a continuum across a couple of dimensions. And I've actually created a framework for helping people think about this that I talk about in the book, sort of these 5 facets of where people differ about their money attitudes. So the first thing we have to do is realize that we have an opinion at all, right? That we have a story at all, and that it's not just the right story, sort of quote unquote. Carl Jung has this great quote where he talks about, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And a lot of people are sort of living that out, right? They're being led around by the nose by this money story that they are completely unaware of. And so I think, bringing that money story to light, making it tangible, making it concrete is a big first step. The other thing that I think about is you have to do what Stephen Covey talked about. When Stephen Covey talked about in his killer book, he talks. I'm going to screw up the quote, but basically he says, to overcome the fear of no, you have to have a greater yes burning inside of you, right? Like I think some of these people have not found the thing, right, that means enough to them that it can overcome the fear of that no. And I think that is our job. There's multiple chapters in The Soul of Wealth about the power of meaning and visualization and purpose. And a lot of times we just kind of quit with a goal. And I think it's only after we find that purpose, that yes, that's bigger than the no. And then the last thing is, a lot of people conflate their net worth with their self-worth. And the number in the account is material in how they think about themselves. And they're being disciplined, and disciplined savers and investors is material in how they think of themselves as a good or bad person. And I think we have to disconnect those things a bit and sort of disentangle that net worth from the self-worth and give them something that they care about more than being thrifty.
That makes sense. It is just this really hard thing, and everybody, right, like thinks that what they do is normal. Where you say, right, the way you grew up, that's your normal. That's normal. What everybody else did is abnormal. And then you go to like your life now, and people look at everybody else and think they spend too much, or they spend on stupid things, or they do this, and what they do is actually right. Mm-hmm. And it's just funny to see like people put their biases on everybody else when like baseline of what this person spends, people in other countries are like, that's disgusting, the amount that they spend on clothes and food and things. And they look that way on the wealthier, and then they look that way on the wealthier. And like, you'll talk to people, like I have some clients that are 50 million plus net worth who still look at people wealthier than them. And they're like, oh man, it'd be so much cooler to be that wealthy, right? Like we've all heard those stories of the people on the 60-foot yacht who are jealous of the people at the 200-foot yacht, who are jealous of the Bezos. And like, this is a big theme you talked about in yours too, is like the comparison side of things. And I want to make this practical. Like, I think we all are aware of a lot of these things, and we're all aware that like, keeping up the Joneses is not a good idea. And we're all aware of that comparison is a terrible thing, but like, how does that come into practice? Like, how do we actually how do we not do that?
Yeah, real quick on one of your previous points. I was a missionary in the Philippines. I lived in the Philippines for 2 years. And when I got back from my time in Manila, like I lost a ton of weight. None of my clothes fit, everything was worn out. And so my parents were taking me shopping. And when I was in Manila, the average daily salary for like a middle class worker was $5 a day.
Yeah.
And my parents are taking me out trying to buy me new sneakers and new dress shoes and things like this. And it's whatever, $100, $100 for shoes. And I'm like, I can't do it. Right. Like I couldn't make the switch. I'm like, some poor guy's got to go harvest rice for 3 weeks to buy these shoes. Like I couldn't make the switch. And, you have to adjust to that new environment. It's tricky. You have to adjust. But yeah, it's like your parents would be mad for you spending $1 million on a house because they bought theirs for 70,000. Well, that was a different world, right? That was absolutely a different world. To your comparison, there's a chapter in The Soul of Wealth about comparison being the thief of joy. I won't spoil the story, but it's got a story about a famous artist and one of my favorite stories in the book. But what's crazy to me from that chapter is some of the research that shows that subjective wealth is a better predictor of financial contentment than objective wealth, right? So subjective wealth would be basically who's your reference class. How rich do you feel relative to who you compare yourself to? And so if you're on that 60-foot yacht and you're benchmarking to the 100-foot yacht, maybe you feel quite poor, even though objectively your wealth is in the 98th percentile, right? So the first truth about this, like to make it practical, like you asked, the first truth is we have to be very rigorous and thoughtful about our reference classes. And this even extends to, do I join the country club? Right? Do I move into that neighborhood? We moved about 10 years ago from a nice but modest neighborhood in Alabama to a nicer and completely immodest neighborhood in Atlanta. And my happiness took a hit. I mean, my reference class changed, and I now live by professional athletes and CEOs. And, you go from being kind of squarely middle of the pack to now the low rung on the ladder, even though objectively I'm doing better financially. It matters a great deal, who you're referencing to, who you're benchmarking to. I think people have to be super thoughtful about where they put themselves, the clubs they join, the groups they run in.
Is there benefits though? Is there benefits to that? Because there are people who are like, seeing more wealth and seeing more has helped me realize that like that's doable, right? Like there's the whole thing of like, where I grew up, I always say this, like where I grew up, the wealthiest people were doctors. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But like in every wealthy area, it's not the doctors, right? It's always business owners, executives, et cetera, right? That's the wealthy people. And so like when I grew up, I didn't really even see that being a business owner was an option, right? I didn't really know anybody who did it. And the people who didn't do it well. Like I know 2 of them who went bankrupt. So like in my mind, I never even thought about becoming a business owner, and I was kind of just forced into it. And luckily, it opened up my world. And I think, being with my wife and seeing her family and the people they grew up with, like, they went to school with the CEOs, kids of Cold Stone, and like all of these really, really big people. And I think part of that helped me realize that like, oh wait, I've heard my whole life that you can achieve and you can do things like if you work hard enough and you believe in yourself, but like no way belief is that thing. But then I think there is part to seeing like, oh wait, like there are people who do these things and that's good. But then there's also the other side of like, oh, I don't have what they have, so that's bad, right? Like, do you think there is good and bad to that?
There absolutely is. And I think like many things, it depends on what you're optimizing for. Because there is a truth to like, you have to see it to be it. And like my kids, I grew up like you. I grew up in a place where the richest people I knew were doctors, lawyers, and engineers, right? Who are, upper middle class, but not 1%, not 1% wealthy by national standards. My kids are growing up with people who are 1% wealthy. Right. Yeah. So in some ways, they know that's available to them. but also, is that what you want to optimize for? Like, I don't know that it is, and I don't know that it isn't. And I think there's a lot of good that comes with that, but I've also seen a lot of bad that comes with it. And so, a richly lived life is partially about financial success and sort of, material attainment, but it's only partially, kind of like we talked about earlier. So yes, you open up a new world of possibilities, but also a new world of expectations. And happiness is sort of, your reality minus your expectations, or your expectations minus your reality, however you want to position it. It's sort of the delta between what you expect out of life and what you're getting out of life. So yes, you have opened your eyes, your kids' eyes, to new vistas, new horizons, but now they want those things.
Yeah.
And if they don't get them, they know what they're missing. So it's super complicated.
It's like this fascinating tug of war, because Thomas, to your point, like I grew up, my dad was a dentist and he made probably a couple $100,000 a year. And we lived in an area where I would say like the median of the houses we lived around were probably $200,000, and our house was like $400,000. Mm-hmm. So like my view of that was like, okay, we're doing pretty well. And I can remember we used to go to Lake of the Ozarks, and there would be these people that have these second homes there. And at the time as a kid, I remember my dad always being like, well, what do those people do for a living? Right. And now I'm like, oh, well, those are the people that like Thomas and I typically work with, right? Like somebody that's like truly 1%, and they usually own a business, or they did something, they took an inordinate amount of risk and they bet on themselves. And I think there's an incredible benefit to how my kids are growing up now, because they're seeing business and almost like, I don't want this to come across in a negative light, but like they're seeing how to play the game if you want to optimize for money. Because like some of the most wealthy people that I know, they aren't working 80 hours or 100 hours a week. They've just optimized the game that they're playing, and they understand how to play the game to optimize for that one thing. But then on the flip side of that, I think about, I was in church this past weekend, and they were showing a video of a mission trip that a group from our church went on, and they were in a part in Africa that was extremely poor. And I was just, the thing that stood out to me was how happy the kids in the village were. And these are kids that, were putting clean drinking water in their village, right? Like that's the level of poverty that they're coming from. So I think it's this tug of war, because Daniel, to your point, like once you see it, you feel like you want to have it because that's the lens you have. But then on the flip side, there is a part to like, if you want to do business at a high level, that it can benefit you because you understand what it takes to do that. And that's the viewpoint you have. So it's, I don't know. I think it's like a lot of life. Like it's this constant tug of war, and then figuring out like what's important to you. Like I love business. I love the game of business. But like my oldest daughter, like I don't see any desire in her to like understand and love the game of business. Like she wants to optimize for probably other things in her life than like what I would want to optimize for. And that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got a kid my kids have some time to go before they're adults, but I've got one kid who today would optimize for money and sort of educational attainment and money. I've got one kid who would optimize for creativity, and one kid who would optimize for helping others. And, my living in a neighborhood with a lot of successful people serves one of them very well, the other two maybe not as well. Like, so it is this tug of war. And having lived, having lived in the Philippines as a missionary, I can tell you they are the happiest people I have ever met. Like some of the happiest people I have ever met and worked shoulder to shoulder with had so very little. And it's just a good reminder. It's a good reminder that it is this complex tug of war.
How much do you think their happiness is based on their frame? So the frame and the lens in which they're viewing the world through on a day-to-day basis is what they're seeing every day. Because I lived in South Korea for a year, and the area that we lived in South Korea was not as poor as probably the area that you were talking about in the Philippines, but it was very much like working class South Korea. Like, we're talking whole families in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. And like, that was the normal standard of living. And I didn't see any decrease in happiness. And I think about like even the street that I live on now, there's a lot of successful people, but they're not smiling any more than the people that were living in those 1 and 2 bedroom apartments.
Yeah, it's the frame is huge, right? Because the frame, the reference class is a framing effect. Another thing I talk about in that chapter is gratitude. The research shows that people who kept a gratitude journal, so one bullet point every day, like write down one thing you're thankful for every day. That simple act right there had an equivalent impact on people's happiness as antidepressant medication, which, quick caveat, I'm not against medication. I'm not saying you
Both.
shouldn't take psych meds, but it's incredible to think about that positive frame, even momentarily, 60 seconds a day of a positive frame, and counting your blessings can have that big an impact. So yeah, being intentional about your frames is like the whole ball game.
So this is a little bit switching gears, but it's one thing that like I've been thinking about recently. So like context wise, like so my wife works somewhere and I don't think she gets paid very little relative to what I make. We really don't need her to work in any single way. But one thing that's really important to her is like, hey, I don't think I'm being compensated fairly for the work I do and how well I do work. Right. And so I think the way that I'm thinking about this, and I didn't realize it, right, is like all household income, it's fine. We make plenty. Really, money doesn't matter anymore. Let's just enjoy our life. But for her and for a lot of people, money is the scorecard to the value you bring and the work that you provide, right? And so feeling like you work really hard and not being compensated fairly is hard. But on the flip side, part of people working really hard and making stupid amounts of money more than they ever need is just like going back to early on and being driven, being hardworking, and like always having to work towards something. And money just ultimately is, for a lot of people, is the scorecard that you're doing well. It's not necessarily your self-worth, but it is a result that comes from working really hard and becoming really good at something. I know this is a lot, but like how do you balance that? Because I actually like I don't think I saw that early on when I just think of household income, but to me that actually is starting to make a lot of sense why it does matter to people, and it's not bad to be driven to be paid fairly, but it's all about like why are you thinking like this, right? Is it because of getting more money for things you don't care about, or is it to feel value because you're working really hard?
Yeah, so in the Behavioral Investor, my last book, there's a neuroscientific study that shows kind of brilliantly that people value money irrespective of what it will buy for them. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but it's actually quite
I think that's
irrational,
really
right?
true.
Like we use money as a scorecard irrespective of how it can buy us food, clothes, cars, whatever. Like we treat it like liquid happiness. And so this is sort of human nature, right? So what your wife is doing is you can tell her tonight at dinner is completely normal, right? Like it's completely normal, it's completely human. There's a chapter in the book where I talk about the happiness research, and it matters a lot how you measure happiness. We're sort of all familiar with that 75K study, which is like 100K now. And it shows that the way that they were measuring happiness sort of plateaued north of $100,000 a year. Well, the way they were measuring happiness was decidedly physical. So, like at $100,000 a year, your stomach's full, you're warm, you sleep in a nice bed, you have insurance so you can get cold medicine. Like the physical pains of life are, about as handled as they can be at certain level. But when you look at maybe a more meaningful measure of happiness, which is like subjective self-appraisal, qualitative self-appraisal, which is just like, hey, Jacob, Bud, how you doing, Jacob? How you doing, Thomas? And you sort of tell me how your life is doing. People's happiness is up and to the right, up to $500,000 a year, which is where the study stopped. And so there is some evidence to suggest that for most people, more money does make them happier. And part of it is this very human reason that I think your wife is wrestling with, which is just, am I of value? And that doesn't mean that she's greedy. That doesn't mean that she's got it twisted or that she's doing anything wrong. And I think we should put the screws to employers. I think we should put the screws to employers to pay people fairly. And I think all else being equal, she should go somewhere else and get more money. The problem is when all else is not equal. Because I think a lot of times what people will do is go, well, I'll go travel 50% more for that extra 10,000. I'll drive 20 minutes longer each way to a different office to get another 10,000. That's where I think we start to make some big trade-offs. But hey, man, all else equal, it is very human to want money. We value it as a good in and of itself, and more of it can sometimes make us happy.
Yeah. Yeah. And you talk about in the book too, that I like that, for a lot of people, they're just like, money doesn't provide happiness. And then if they do, they're like, well, there is the study, right? Once you hit here, basic needs are met. But one of your earliest chapters is that money is a tool. It doesn't fix everything, but it does provide happiness. And like, what are the ways that money does provide happiness? Because like my own money story, I think money provides me significantly more happiness now than it was 2 years ago. And I'll wrap up this story after you talk about the ways that we see how.
Yeah. So I talked about one of them just a second ago, which is basically buying the absence of misery, right? So money can buy us a safe place to live, nutritious food, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. It can also help buy us this personal growth we talked about earlier. We talked about the need for achievement and growth. It can send you back to school. It can get you a coach or a shrink. It can get you a dietitian, or, all these things materially improve your life if you're spending it on self-improvement. There's fascinating research that shows that, if Jacob buys a Ferrari tomorrow because he wants to stun on his neighbor, right? That's total Jacob move. If he buys a Ferrari to show off for
my son would love that. They would not fit in the car on the way to school, but my son would love that.
Yeah, see? He brings the Ferrari home. His son thinks he's sweet. Like his son thinks he's sweet. That gives him a little happiness. His wife hugs him a little tighter. Like that gives him happiness, right? Like he revs the V12 at church, and like the parishioners go, "Dang, Jacob's on the come up," right?
That tie is bad.
for a couple,
yeah, right.
For a couple of weeks, that's a lot of happiness, right? But then it kind of falls off a cliff, because of something that we're all prone to called habituation. Humankind just kind of gets used to stuff. We get used to good stuff and we get used to bad stuff. People are, on the one hand, capable of a lot more pain and resilience than I think the average person realizes. Like we think things like, oh, if so-and-so important person in my life died, or, if I lost my job, or, whatever sort of cataclysmic event, like that would be it for me. I couldn't take it. And then it happens, and, eventually we're fine. So we can get used to anything, but we can also get used to anything good. And your Ferrari that was so sweet for the first 2 months is just kind of like your grocery getter at some point, and it's just not as sweet. Unless you buy the Ferrari to join the exotic car club of North Atlanta, and then you've got buddies. So people who spend money to further relational ends, they actually get a lot of happiness out of that. If you buy a fancy guitar to join a band with your college buddies, that brings you happiness. If you just buy a guitar, maybe not. So there's kind of levels to this thing. The last thing I'll talk about is buying time. There's a lot. Oh no, two more things. Giving money away produces, and there's a couple of chapters in the book about giving money away and the power of that. Huge, and people underestimate it. And then buying your time back, buying freedom, buying time back, getting out of work you hate, all of that buys you happiness. You will never, ever catch me mowing my lawn ever in my life.
Praise.
Too many Alabama summers of mowing my lawn, and like we're not going back there, fellas. Totally. And so like that buys me a lot of happiness.
It's so interesting because like I've gone through obviously Jacob's journey is very different. Like he starts as an adult with this huge signing bonus, and like it's so interesting because like we have such different dynamics, and the way we view money is different, which I think is why money is like one of the most interesting things. But like my story was like, I started right as a financial advisor, right? So like it's pretty tough to get started. So like I didn't make very much money. I went to work with Justin Castelli. I asked him to pay me $24,000 a year so I could just learn from him. So like those years early on, I was like going out with my friends. I'm going to eat at home. I'm going to drink at home. And if I can just buy one drink, like I would spend $15 over the whole weekend was my goal. Keep it under that. And then now it goes to the point where maybe I'll make 40x that next year. And the things that I've used the money for are, one, taking the roles away in the business I don't like to do, right? Like admin work, background analysis, like my day-to-day I love 10 times more. I hired out cleaning, right? So what used to be miserable Sundays with me and my wife, all errands, cleaning, et cetera, becomes good quality time. And I don't have to do something I don't really like to do. Yesterday, you can see this. I went to the ER because I sliced open 3 fingers, had to get a bunch of stitches, right? Didn't have to one time think about the bill. Like didn't at any point think about what is this going to cost me? My wife's sisters in town pay for their dinner, right? Like that brings me happiness. Like you leave Sam's and you see them doing donation for suicide. Like, great, I'm going to give money to that. And like, I was looking at the points you had and I was like, it's really weird to actually go through this and reflect and feel that, because like I bought a new car last year. I got used to it, right? We bought another new car. I love it. I still absolutely love it. Don't hate on it. But like, I became used to it. But like being able to do more trips, being able to outsource things I don't like, being able to, get nice, like do nicer things for my nieces and nephews. Like those are the things that like, when I look back on like the last year or so of my life, like those are the things that stand out. And I'm like, it's interesting. Like it's fun to make more money. It's fun to spend more money, but there are just the things that really like hit home for you. And for a lot of people who have a lot of money and you see that they aren't happy, you do go back to like how they spend their money, how they spend their time. They're not really doing the things that will make them happy.
So, that's exactly what that's exactly like where I would sort of end that thought, is to say, it's not the money itself, it's how you spend it. Because there are plenty of people who would pass the bell ringer at Sam's without giving, right? There's plenty of people who would go Dutch with the in-laws or, the sister or whoever. I mean, there's plenty of people who would continue to, sweat it out on Saturday mornings, vacuuming the financial advice office to save a couple of bucks. And so it is partially the money, but it is least as much how you've deployed it. And there's, I talk that the name of the chapter in the book is money can kind of sort of buy you happiness sometimes if you spend it right. Like so brave of me to take such a strong stance. But, that really is the truth. There are plenty of people for whom all the riches in the world buy very little happiness. And it is largely because they're spending it wrong.
It's interesting. And it doesn't mean it's easy, but I think it is important to kind of like step back and assess, what are you doing? Does it help you? Does it increase your happiness? Because like some people out of principle just don't do things, right? So I have a client who dad is worth hundreds of millions. Grandpa's worth more than that. So dad's a failure because he isn't worth as much as grandpa. She makes, she's mid 30s. She's going to make over $3 million this year, scaling quickly above that. And her parents, they like, she feels like a failure because she doesn't make enough. Her dad owns a bunch of land right outside of a major sports facility. And he goes on Sundays and he collects the payments for people to park. He's worth hundreds of millions of dollars and he goes there and accepts the cash because he doesn't have to pay somebody else. And he likes that he just gets the cash and, you don't really have to say anything about it. And I think like I heard that story and like all of these things we're talking about just hit me, and like, man, some people are so rooted in money and saving money and never spending money that they don't realize like he gave up every Sunday, half of the year, to be with his family, to collect what's probably like $2,000 of cash, and he's worth probably $300 million. Right. And I think most people think that when you have money, you just eventually learn how to spend it on the things that make your life better. But time and time again, I actually see that not to be true. Like I'll be in a conversation with a couple and they'll be fighting over something. And I'm like, how come you guys just don't like pay for a cleaning lady? And they're like, well, one of us stays at home. So like, why would we pay for that? It's like, because it would make both of your life better, and you can. And they're like, but then like, does that mean that person should go back to work? No. well, how come you guys don't like hire like twice a week for a nanny to come so one of the spouse that stays at home can go run errands and do things and work out and blah blah blah, like because they don't have an income, so that's stupid. It's like, who cares? Like, once you make money, take a step back from like what's right. And this is leading into this chapter about unlearning, right? Like you talk about in the book. And I think it's one of the hardest things I've seen about money for people is how to unlearn the way that they think, especially when you have these huge rises of income, right? Almost all my clients went from I make okay money to, oh my gosh, I make more money than anybody I know. How do you unlearn everything from before and change?
So, I'll go back to my comment, and maybe now's a good time to introduce the framework. I'll go back to my comment before about, most people are not cognizant of having learned, right? None of us or very few of us sort of set out in a formal way to learn about money. We just sort of pick it up by osmosis through our parents and whatever. So when we studied this, the way that I came across this framework that I talk about in the book is I actually interviewed 425 couples. And I asked them, what do you fight about when you fight about money? And we did this at Orion, like ostensibly to be this thing about couples and money. And it did generate some cool research there. But what we found is effectively kind of like the skeleton key for people's values, because these fights, these disagreements were really when one person's values ran into another person's values. So the first thing we found was communication, right? Communication. Some people are direct, some people are indirect. Second thing is worry. Some people worry about money a lot. Some people aren't that worried. And the third one is my favorite. We call it function, which is basically, is money best used to enjoy today or to secure against an uncertain tomorrow? And if you think about those two things, they're both important.
Yep.
And yet people tend to have grown up and decamped heavily into one philosophy or the other. Like people are either like team YOLO or team save for tomorrow. And what we try and do is help illuminate those preferences and then help people meet in the middle. But you've got to help them be aware that they have that preference in the first place before they can sort of meet their partner in the middle.
And do you see they're opposite a lot? Because I see in most couples, they are typically opposite. Every once in a while, maybe like 10% of my clients are very aligned and they think the exact same way, but most are like fully opposites.
Well, that third dimension was the number one thing people thought about. And what's interesting is you get all these values wrapped around it, right? So think about the person who wants to spend to enjoy today. They think of themselves as fun-loving, generous, and seizing the day.
Yeah.
Their partner thinks of them as frivolous, wasteful, and unprepared, if they're sort of in the other camp. Then you've got the save for tomorrow person. They see themselves as, sturdy and reliable and consistent. And their partner sees them as lame and a fun hater and cheap, And so the fourth one was interesting. This was the only one where there were cultural or gender preferences that were at play. And this was around orientation. So sort of an individualistic versus a collectivistic orientation to money. Non-white, non-Western folks tended to be more collectivistic. Oh, and women. Non-white, non-Western, and women tended to be more collectivistic in their thinking about money. So, if my sister needs help with her light bill, that's on me, right? Like that's on me to help her. That's part of my responsibility is to help them. White Western men tended to take the sort of put your own oxygen mask on first sort of mentality, which is like, hey, this is my money. I made this. It's for me. It's for me and my family. I'm going to take care of mine first. And if there's any left over, maybe we can talk. But like, I'm doing me. You go do you. And again, they're both sensible approaches. Like, I mean, there's upside to both approaches. I mean, this sort of put your own mask on first mentality is, you know, sort of a responsible way to think about things. But then we also know there's a lot of joy and goodness that comes from giving. So again, lots of values. And then the last one was importance. Some people just don't care about money. Like, you know, from a does this make you a good person? Like, is making money core to what it means to live a good life. For some people, money is absolutely the means by which they keep score. For other people, it could not be more distant from the, sort of their concept of the good life. So, you know, that's my long-winded answer of just saying, to begin to unlearn, right? You have to know that you learned at all, and you need a framework that's in the book, right? You need this framework for thinking about, how do I even think about money? How does my partner think about money? Where are we at cross purposes, and where could we sort of meet in the middle?
Yeah, I feel like you definitely have to know your spouse, right? Because I think there's always a money spouse, and I think, okay, that's fine, right? Everybody has different roles, but I think the way that you use your money does have to be aligned with both people, right? And I think, you know, sometimes the couples, people will tell you like every couple should have combined finances entirely. And while I do agree that most couples should have mostly combined financials, right? What I found is on this upper end of like very wealthy people, this is less common. But when you have good amount of money, but like not so much excess, so it doesn't matter what you do with it, the values play becomes really, really important, right? How you spend money is wrong, how I spend money is right. And the other person thinks the same thing. And this is where I think creating systems around this can be really, really helpful, right? Hey, we've gone through our financial plan. We can spend each $6,000 or $500 a month on whatever we want, right? And sometimes it's actually valuable to say, I don't even care what that is that you spend. We know this is fine. Let's each have our own credit card, or let's each have our own checking account just for wants. But we decided that this is what's good. Let's stick with it. Let's not hide money, hide spending, do things like that creates a problem. But hey, you spend on how you want. I spend on how I want. I spend on what I value. You spend on what you value. It's perfect. It fits our financial plan. I think eventually you can kind of merge that and be like, hey, I found that person does good spending. We can get to that point. But I think there's a lot of people who are scared of merging finances because what the other person does is wrong and they watch it. And people who don't understand money think the day you get married should be combined. If you don't trust your significant other with money at that point. But I don't think it comes down to trust. It just comes down to you getting used to accepting that what other people value is different than what you value. And people play on this whole trust thing. I just don't see it that way.
Yeah.
You know what's really interesting about this whole conversation is that we haven't talked at all about like tax strategies or investing or cash flow analysis or any of that. And this is like a shameless plug for why I think a lot of people should have somebody that they're talking to about personal finances in their life, whether that's a financial advisor or coach or whatever it may be, a parent, family member. Because I think too oftentimes we don't think about these things and we don't have these conversations. And I think the goal of like any of those people in your life is to help you maximize your money and whatever is important to you. And I think it's, you know, Daniel, I think your book does an incredible job of that.
Yeah. And I know you got to run, right? That's my guess right now. We're well over an hour. So I'm going to let us wrap up. Whatever you want to say before we go, I just want to hand it off to you, but we really appreciate the time, man. This has been so fun.
No, this was a blast, guys. I think Jacob's point is really good. You know, I've written in my previous books about the reasons why people need to work with an advisor is probably not the reason that they think. And there's evidence to suggest that people who work with an advisor do better in a dollar and cents way. Yes, like that's kind of to be expected. And indeed, the research bears that out. But they're also more prepared for an emergency. They're happier on average. They're less likely to get divorced. They have higher levels of marital communication. I mean, money touches every part of our lives. And the whole reason I wrote this book, right? The whole reason I wrote this book is because the world has never been richer than it is today. When this country was founded, 85% of people in the world were living in poverty. Today, that number is 9%, right? Like capitalism has brought us this incredible explosion of the middle class. The world has never experienced abundance and equality the way that it has now. And I expect that trend to continue and even be hastened. And yet, we're experiencing unprecedented levels of depression and anxiety and disconnection and loneliness. And we have not, as a human family, figured out to do what Jacob's talking about, which is to bridge that gap from abundance to well-being. And that's what I tried to do in the book. So it was a blast to have a chance to talk with y'all about it today.
Yeah, Daniel, we really appreciate the time, and everybody, again, it's The Soul of Wealth. I think it's an absolute great read. Today, we kind of just asked him all these great questions that like did feed into the book, but it did not ruin the book. So highly recommend getting it. And Daniel, while we're here, I'm going to ask you to do another podcast next year, and I'm going to come with the 10 biggest behavioral biases or things that hinder my clients' lives and just dive into it. Because I think these are the most fun episodes of just talking to somebody who really gets the behavioral side of things, because I don't think people realize how complex it is until they actually start thinking about it. But don't want to take up too much of your time, man. We really appreciate you coming on. And everybody, thank you for listening. Please rate and subscribe, and we'll see you back next week.